about to get up from her lap.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory to Jesus Christ. So tonight we're going to start a study of some of the Apostolic Fathers and of their writings. And we're going to start this evening with the Didache, which is one of the very oldest such writings that we have. But in order to truly appreciate the Didache and to get some sense as to what was going on, I want first to talk about Jerusalem, say in 30 AD, by the year 30 AD, and because at that time, really the best phrase you can use to describe Jerusalem is that it was hot. It was a hot mess, and that sounds really weird because we think of it as being an almost exclusively Jewish city, where we had the Jews and all of their governing thing. We know from the story about the crucifixion that there was a Roman governor and that he had a lot of influence, a lot of power as far as things that were going to be done only with their permission. For example, they allowed a Jew to sit on the throne, but that Jew, Herod in this case, at the time of the crucifixion, was ruled only at the pleasure of Rome and could be removed and could be set aside in somebody else's name if the governor was not happy with him, was not content with him. And so at this time, for the Jews that were in Jerusalem and in that area, there are really, and throughout Israel, there are really two schools of thoughts, and it's important to kind of keep these in mind. The first school of thought in Judaism at that time had to do with what's called Messianism, having to do with Messiah. And the people that held to this belief believed that the Messiah would be a king who would punish the Romans. In other words, would chase the Romans out. You remember reading about this, some in the New Testament, where it starts with the idea that there's a disappointment, or an expectation, I guess, maybe more realistically, that the Messiah would come as a king, would come with an army, would come with people that could come and then just throw the Romans out. And then Jerusalem and the nation of Israel would be returned back to being a province, a nation of the Jews. So that was one school of thought in Judaism. But then there was another one as well, and that was called Apocalypticism, which asserted a more permanent writing of history. In other words, people that believed this believed that it would be changed for all time, that there would be a Messiah that would change what was going on in Israel, what was going on in Jerusalem, would change it permanently. And never again would there be any situation like being under the control of the Romans or under their governance or whatever the case may have been. So we start out, first of all, with the idea that the Jews themselves, in some respects, were fairly fractured in their expectations about what were going to happen. While they were fractured, the Romans, as we mentioned, allowed Judaism to continue, but exerted some controls. For example, the chief priest in the temple would be approved by the Romans. And if they didn't approve whoever they wanted to put over there, that person could simply not be the chief priest. Somebody that agreeable with the Romans would have to be doing that. And so the Roman influence went into all of the important parts of Jewish society at that particular time. And so we have this that had to be a real, something that was unpopular, I guess, with the people in the city, or at least with a lot of people in the city, for different reasons. So by 30 AD, we had several parties, right? And these parties become the real breakdown, the real differences among Jewish culture in Jerusalem and throughout the nation. And the first, of course, are the Pharisees. Now, Jesus was kind of hard on the Pharisees, but in a lot of respects, he really was okay. He really was kind of in their camp. He agreed with them on a lot of things, although he did not agree with them on the way that they used their power and some of the things that they taught. And so we have the Pharisees. And later on, once Christianity became established or became a thing, the Pharisees were very, very hostile against Christianity, more so than other parts of the city. And so when they did this, and when of course, they clashed with Jesus frequently, Later on, when Christianity comes around, the Pharisees were in stout opposition to that, and because of that, that was something that they, that was one party that had a lot of power in the city at this time, in 30 AD. That's kind of an arbitrary date, but it's close to the time of the crucifixion, so it kind of tells you what the city was like when that happened. There was another group, not near as powerful, but they was called the heirs of Ezra. And these people profited or posited that the fall of Israel was due to a failure to obey the law. That in other words, because Israel did not steadfastly obey the law in every respect, the heirs of Ezra said that is why we are suffering. In that respect, they were kind of like the Pharisees, but they were more focused on just what the law said and actual simple following or obedience to the law. The Sadducees were a religious party that consisted of nobility and high priestly families. It only recognized the first 5 books of Moses. It did not recognize any other part, anything else as being scripture. And they believed that they kept alive the original form of Judaism, the old form, the traditional form, so that the Sadducees said, well, that's what we've got, and that's what everybody needs to have. And so that was one of the parties that were doing this. The Sadducees also denied the existence of angels or of demons. They denied the concept of a resurrection. They denied the concept of immortality of the soul. And so it's kind of hard to see how many people would sign on to that, but some people did. And so that was kind of the substance of them. Another one that was there was the Essenes. The Essenes believed that there were 2 competing forces. There was God, who was good, and then there's evil of various kinds. They don't necessarily center that on one being or one particular place, but that evil was kind of scattered all about. It was all over the place. But that the only good was in God, which is a fairly reasonable kind of way of looking at things in a lot of ways. And so what they believed, though, they also borrowed something from Zoroastrianism, which was a Persian religion. And so they had this concept taken from Zoroastrianism having to do that said that there would be a final battle, that there would be, and that in that battle there would be the defeat of evil, but it was less of a Jewish concept in the way they presented it than it was Zoroastrianism or Persian at its very essence. So because of this, we had these particular parties that were in the city, but then we also had other people who were doing things a little bit like Jesus. There were other people who would say that they would heal, that they would cast out demons. We don't know how successful they were, but these people were wandering around and making these claims. And so we get to what is really kind of a convoluted and a complex situation in Jerusalem, and divisions among the Jews themselves, and then upon individuals that are going around and saying certain things about what they can do, which kind of, in some respects, certainly kind of mimicked Christ, or tried to mimic Christ. So when we think about this, and we think about Christ being in the middle of this, about Jesus being amidst all these parties and all these people with these different beliefs and these different conceptions and these different goals really at the same time, then when we look at Christ, it kind of brings things into a certain perspective. Christ was, I don't know that he was hesitant, but he had to wait for just the right moment to enter the city, right? Because at the time this would have been the entrance, the grand entrance into Jerusalem, and the children were there with the palms and all this kind of things. But there also would have been people who would not have been happy to see Christ, who did not understand him as having the things or the notion or the power that we understand him to have, or to have had, especially at that time. And so, but Christ really was operating. In the past, we've talked about this idea of kenosis, and this idea of kenosis really defines a lot of what he does, including the way in which he enters the city of Jerusalem the way in which he presents himself. And you remember kenosis, so this is the self-emptying. You know, the setting aside prerogatives, setting aside power that he has in order to come in a humble kind of way. So we have all of this, and there's a million, not a million, but there are a number of different belief systems, a number of different groups, a number of conflicting people with conflicting beliefs among the Jews in Jerusalem at that time. But at the same time, the Greek world also had a very substantial existence, a very substantial presence in Jerusalem. You remember that it affected the Hebrew world. The Septuagint, which is the Orthodox Old Testament, was in fact written in Greek. It was a Greek thing that was translated and written in Greek, and this is the Old Testament that is our everyday use. And so it did not have the Hebrew Old Testament, but instead the Septuagint became what it was. So all of this was going on. There's the Greek influence, there's Zoroastrianism of all things, and any number of Jewish parties with different beliefs that are in conflict, greater or less or more, with each other. And so because of this, we have what is really a very fluid situation. It is really fluid at all. Now it's also, if we go ahead a few, not too much longer, in AD 70, we'll find Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The temple is going to be destroyed. And all of these things, both Jews and Christians had to reorganize at that point to deal with whatever it is that their options were or their goals were in the city, with that goes. But with the destruction of the temple, that was the final break between both Christians and Jews. And if you remember, in fact, the letter to the Hebrews argues that the temple in Jerusalem is unnecessary. And so that argument was made by Paul himself. And so by that point in time, with the church kind of getting off the ground and becoming its own force, if you will, there's now this other schism, so to speak, between people who believe that the temple was in fact the heart of Judaism, and people that were starting to think, the temple isn't really that important. Probably was nice, but we can have our religion, we can have our God, Christianity in this case, and we do not have to worry about anything else. So there's that situation as well. And then finally, there were a number of what we call mystery religions. Mystery religions were religions that were based on some secret mystery, in some fashion. And it kind of ties in with Gnosticism, which is going to become a big thing not too long after this. So with mystery religions, there was these fed off of there was this increasing disillusionment with religions that were in effect. People were saying, I'm not getting much out of this, I don't really believe this part or that part or whatever it is. And so the mystery religions had their own little area that they lived at. And it dealt with very small things. Mystery religions dealt with cross, it dealt with love, it dealt with all these day-to-day things, and not with salvation, not with the hereafter, but they're all operating too at the same time. And then finally, there's a group called the God-fearers, which are kind of on the fringe of Judaism. And they're not a huge thing, but they're there in any event. Well, then at this point, I'll talk about Gnosticism. Gnosticism was, in fact, a major heresy that troubled Christianity for the first, say, 2 or 3 centuries. And the idea about Gnosticism is this. Gnosticism gives some kind of worldview of cosmology, but what really happened with Gnosticism is that typically there would be this book, right? Something would be published, and it would be called, it would be attributed to somebody of some repute, and then it would be put out as this kind of competing story for Christ. So there was, for example, a Gospel of Thomas, there was a Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and nowadays, of course, people are picking these up. They're going, Mary Magdalene, a woman wrote a Gospel. This has to be the right thing. But it was really a terrible thing as far as Christianity was concerned, because people had this idea that it was based on a fantasy. In other words, that it was more or less, I guess, than what it said, what it claimed to be, which was the religion founded by the resurrected Christ. And so it was a very difficult thing, and Gnosticism, when I say it was a difficult thing for a couple of centuries, it was battled everywhere. It was everywhere that it was going on. Even in Egypt, where in Alexandria, where Gnosticism became a terrible thing that had to be fought there. It would show up all over the place, but it was all simply fiction. And so Gnostics believed that there was some special wisdom or knowledge that gave them the keys to heaven, but that nobody else had unless they had joined this Gnostic religion. And so that became a really difficult kind of thing, especially not so much at this particular time, but over the next couple of centuries. It was really huge. And people would just write these things, these gospel of whoever, whatever, and then say, this is the real thing. We have this. This was given to us by God or angels or whatever, and this is the truth, unlike what you say the truth happens to be. So in that context, if we think about all of these different currents and all of these different beliefs and competing factions, then we have to look back and we have to say, where is that strand that leads to our Christianity? And really, that begins very much, I think, with John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist was actually preaching a return to the basics of Judaism, to the contents of the law, to the books of the law. He wanted everything to go back to that. The idea of baptism that he brought forth, and he baptized tons of people, was symbolic. It was symbolic in the sense that a person was giving up or repenting of whatever sins he or she committed by not following basic Judaism. And so by dunking them, by doing this, by baptizing them, he was, in his mind, it was his intention to bring people back to Judaism. Now, we don't know exactly. We know that he knew who Jesus was, and we know about how difficult it was for him to baptize Jesus. We hear about that at the Theophany in January. But that was kind of his beginning. And I think to some respects, Jesus, I don't know exactly how you clarify that or how you put that together with the idea that this is the Messiah, except that perhaps he believed, his actual belief was that Jesus would bring back this essence of Judaism, and people would go back to living the law that they were supposed to live. And so there's John the Baptist who is out there and he's running around, at least he will be for a little bit. Later on, there are more debates, there's more division, there are more people coming in with different ideas. And so Jerusalem was just a place that was really, it was astonishingly divided, more so than we might think. And I think in the past, early on, when I read the gospel and I read the Bible about that, I kind of thought, well, yeah, there are the Sadducees and there are the Pharisees and they're at odds, but most people there just were really, really, really simple Jews. That they just wanted to see the Messiah, and there it was. But there are a lot more things going on than that. And so that is why it was such a splintered kind of city there in AD 30, just a few years before the crucifixion of Christ himself. We have, at that time, we can really sum it up by saying there are differences between the people that that saw Jesus as the Messiah. There are differences at the same time with people who believed that Jesus was just kind of a faker, and they had their own beliefs. And so we had all of that. And then there was this Hellenistic influence as well, Hellenistic meaning Greek. And so the Greeks would also have this idea, and so there that it was. Well, and where that really became important at the first time is when we had this controversy about deacons. You remember that? That we had Hellenistic widows, we had other widows, we had poor women, we had all these things, and the idea was that deacons were needed to serve these widows. And so it becomes leads to the ordination of the first deacons. So at that point, that's kind of where we find ourselves as we move into this point of time where Jesus is approaching his crucifixion and then his resurrection. And then this is going to lead to what I think of ordinarily that in the first instance of perhaps the first and the greatest of the documents of the Apostolic Fathers being the Didache. So when that happened, when that arose some years later after the death and resurrection, and the church was just beginning, there was a conflict between the church in Jerusalem and the church in Antioch and elsewhere in Asia Minor as to where non-Jews were going to be admitted. Right? Remember, they all started out almost, you could say, as kind of an off group from the Jews that had this additional belief about Jesus being the Messiah and what that meant. And so we saw this in Galatians in 1:8 to 2:21, having to do with whether or not non-Jews were going to be admitted to the church. And so in Galatians, they talk about that. And in Galatians, what we find is that Peter is challenged for not eating with the Gentiles. And this is important. We'll see this in a minute. It's important because of the privacy, the importance of the Eucharistic meal and the agape meal and the Eucharist itself, the way that it was done under this particular document, the Didache. So, in the midst of all of this, then, we're seeing the appearance of Christians. Christians were primarily found, they were in small communities, in urban areas. There are some elsewhere, I'm sure, but mostly in areas where there are enough people to support that kind of thing. And it's important to keep this in mind, too, because this will be something that's important for the next 3 or 4 centuries anyway. And that is that there were no priests. Instead, whenever there was a church done, and think about Paul, he goes to all these cities, right? He establishes a church. And then the person and then he would leave, he goes somewhere else, right? And he says, I'm going to leave so-and-so in charge. And when he did that, he would leave this person to do, it would be a combination of functions of a bishop and then of a priest. And so in the early church, the celebrant of the liturgy or whatever service they were doing would have been the actual bishop. There was only one church per town. There is one bishop, and when you have one bishop, then that's what he does. And so these services would have been conducted by what we know of or what we think of as a bishop. Later on, let's say the town got big enough and it called for 2 churches. Then in that case, they looked to the presbyters, they looked to the elders, and it's from those people that the first priests were chosen. But that was only when the bishop himself was not available to do the service or celebrate the service at that church. And so we start with bishops. There were deacons. Deacons were being ordained from the very beginning, or pretty close to the beginning. And then they were the ones who were doing this for the church. Now, these weren't the bishops weren't necessarily called bishops. Many times, for example, in Egypt, in Alexandria, they called this person the president of the assembly. And in other places, they've used that same word, but it means the same thing. This is the person that is responsible for this place and runs the place and does the teaching of the services and that kind of thing. So we have the beginning of some kind of structure, if you will, of clergy and what clergy are going to be there. And so that would be what would happen as far as it goes. Now, the earliest churches were really focused on what they believed would be an imminent end of time, the end of the world, that Christ would return, and that when he returned, that the world would be ended. And so a lot of the early communities that were focused on that kind of thing, they would share property, they would engage in communal activities, and so it would be kind of a little bit different focus than what we talked about. From the Middle East, from Israel, from Egypt, it spread fairly quickly. It spread into Asia Minor, spread into Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, and North Africa, all within a reasonably short period of time. But the structure every time that the church expanded would be the same. And so you would have these things. And so, as I mentioned a minute ago, if in fact there was this issue of that maybe the church had gotten too big, it wasn't really possible to do this, or the city itself was so big that there was some advantage to opening another church elsewhere in the city, then we started seeing the rise of the priestly class. Priests were originally drawn from elders, from presbyters, and so that became a natural thing. But it applies even now. For example, if the bishop comes here, unless he gives me permission to serve, he serves. If he's here, he's the one that's going to serve unless he says otherwise. And that's the same rule that has always been the case throughout Christendom from the very beginning as far as that goes. So we have all of these places where it is going to. We have churches that are being built. Well, not so much built, because the original churches were house churches. They were in somebody's house, in a room at somebody's house. Eventually, they would start building churches, and when they did, we won't really get into it here, but almost all the early churches are built in the shape of a cross. And so that's happening. But in the early part of it, that is what it is. Now, so we look at that, kind of keeping those things in mind. Then I want to talk a little bit about the Didache and some of the things that the Didache said. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind, I think, is that as far as people were concerned, that the Didache and Jewish prayer and Christian prayer were early Christian prayer. Now, Jewish prayer was pretty well solidified, if you will. They had particular times during the day when they were supposed to pray, and did. I would expect by and large. And they were also by particularly set prayers. There was the Shema, there was different parts of this thing. And so people had prayers. They knew that they would pray in the morning. They knew they would pray at the ninth hour, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Oftentimes they would pray beyond that. But basically that was the structure of prayer on a daily basis as far as daily prayer goes. So when that happens, and when it starts talking about these things, then the question might be, well, what did the early Christians do? They did not necessarily do anything as far as, they didn't use the Jewish prayers. They used prayers, and we see this if you read Paul, if you read some of the Gospels, you see that prayers are offered by Christ himself, by some of the apostles, by Paul, who often writes in the form of a prayer, at least in some of his letters. And so it's because of this we start seeing some differences as far as how prayer goes. And so then this is where we start seeing differences and sources of belief for the early church. And so if you look at the Didache, and you pull this out, it's if you turn to that, and so in the Didache, it starts with that really great beginning. There are 2 ways, one of life and one of death. And it goes into a bit of explanation about this and why life and death are so similar. Or not similar, but dissimilar, and how these 2 paths are 2 completely different things. And so they say the way of life has to do with this. The way of life says, first, you shall love the God who made thee. Secondly, thy neighbor is thyself. And whatsoever thou would not have done to thyself, do not do thou to another. The real basic kind of prayers we teach all the kids. Every kid gets that. And so this is the beginning, right? This is the very beginning of the Didache, where it talks about the way of life and the way of death. Now, what's interesting is next, and that is that the prayers kind of diverge from Jewish prayers in some particular respects because of the way that prayer in many cases is focused on people that may not be your best friends. All right? So if you look at the Didache, you look at the third little, very long paragraph actually, at the end of there are two ways, one of life and one of death. It says, now the teaching of these words is this: bless those that curse you, and pray for your enemies, and fast for those that persecute you. All right, so see, this is directly from the teachings in the Gospels. This is not something that the Didache came up with. They instead picked up what they knew from the Gospels or what they had been taught. And this is what we see in this, where we talk about the teachings on the way of life. And then it talks about there's more beyond that, the second commandment of the teaching. There would do no murder, do not commit adultery, and so on and so forth. And so all of these things are in place. And all of these things are being taught and being prayed as a matter of daily prayer by the Christians themselves. Now, it's worth noting this, and that is, of course, at the time there were no publishers, right? You couldn't, there was no Bible being published, there was no letters of Paul being published. Instead, the way that all of this kind of circulated is interesting. Much of it originally was done orally. That people would say, we have, somewhere, for example, Mark, somewhere that Gospel of Mark landed, and the people that were there would say, here's what Mark taught us, here's what the Apostle Mark taught us, and then would say, and oftentimes would know it word for word. Remember, oral communication of ideas was very much a thing in the ancient world. Even the Greeks, like Homer's works, were recited from memory. And so people would recite these by memory. The Gospels, and later on, the letters from Paul and some of the other letters, that's how initially it would be heard. But then over time, those papers, those letters ended up somewhere. Probably said Paul was going to write to Corinth. It's probably sitting in Corinth, or wherever it was he wrote it to. And then people would start making copies of it. And then the copies would go from here or there, whatever. But it was a very slow process before a church would have what we think of as the basic books of the Bible. It took a long time. And so in a lot of respects, this that we find in the Didache, where it talks about the commandments, about what we don't do, what we're not supposed to do, is all the more important, because what we know is that this means that this is how people learn. That this is what was driven into people's minds as far as what is expected of you as a Christian, and what is supposed to happen, and what you are supposed to do. And so the Didache is really it's really a beautiful thing to read anyway. But in it we see these first essential teachings that every Christian would be expected to understand and to follow. That would be what would guide their life. And so in this book that I have, that goes on for several sections. And so it talks about this, it offers interpretations of the thing, and so it goes on for a good little while as far as the way of life. Then it kind of does the same thing as far as the way of death. It talks about, it says, first of all, it is wicked and full of cursing, murders, adulteries, lust, fornications, theft, idolatries, and it goes on about things we ought not do, what we are barred from doing as Christians. Persecutors of the good, haters of truth, lovers of lies, knowing not the reward of righteousness. So this is the way that the early church really learned. This is the way that they were taught, and the way that people that never had seen a writing that we think of as scripture were catechized and were brought into the faith and the understanding that they had. So they have all of this. Once they talk about what is good and what is bad, then after that they start talking about baptism. And by baptism, they essentially just say the same thing as we often do, although it's a little bit different because baptisms, they didn't have the horse trials like we do. And then they'd go outside into a creek or a river or something of the sort. And so there are real instructions for this. Concerning baptism, baptize thus, having first rehearsed all these things, baptize in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit in running water. But if there is no running water, baptize in other water, and if thou cannot, in cold, then in warm. But if thou hast neither, pour water 3 times on the head in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. We've done that a time or two. And so there are the rules about baptism. There are rules about fasting, and just like it is now, fasting on Wednesday and Friday, and every other day of the week, you're free to do as you like. And then the primary prayer, the best prayer, the one that comes first of all is the Our Father. And so that's given as the prayer, the preeminent prayer for people that will give. And the Our Father would be prayed 3 times a day. And really where that kind of falls into place would be morning. And then there would be the 6th hour, which is noon. And then there would be probably the 12th hour, which would be like in the evening, at dusk. And so people would pray again at that point in time. One of the things that's striking about this is that, and it's not that this never happened in Jewish prayer, but intercessory prayer, especially intercessory prayer for enemies or for adversaries of one kind or another, are now this standard thing that we find in Christian prayers as of the Didache. And it's less common in Jewish prayer as far as that goes. And so this goes along with the love your enemies and all of this kind of thing. And so we have this Eucharistic prayer. Now, another thing that's important, we're kind of getting close to an end here, another thing that's important is the Eucharist. The Eucharist was really, if you read this carefully, it sounds like it was done in 2 parts, right? Initially, the Eucharist, it says, first of all, first concerning the cup, we give thanks to thee, our Father, for the holy vine of David, thy child, which thou didst make known to us through Jesus, thy child. To thee be the glory forever. And then a prayer having to do with the broken bread. And then it says, let none eat or drink of your Eucharist except those who have been baptized in the Lord's name. For concerning this also did the Lord say, give not that which is holy to the dogs. But then it sounds like it goes into an agape meal, that there is this wine and this bread, and that as it's talked about here, the Eucharist. But then there's also, after that, we give thanks to thee. If you're satisfied with the food, you give thanks, and you take, and it becomes this thing that at this point becomes communal. The Eucharist itself is only for those who have been baptized, and so they take the Eucharist. But then the people all are able to sit down and have this agape meal. And it's funny because if you think about it, Paul spent some time talking about, I think at Corinth, about people that would for the meal, they would like get the best seat. They'd all sit together with their friends. They're all kind of exclusive. And so this becomes something that Paul had to deal with. But for them, in this case, in the case of the Didache, it appears that this Eucharistic meal, this agape meal, was probably separate from the Eucharist itself, but probably followed immediately after that, as far as that's concerned. And so then as you go on, there are other things having to do with this. There are some interesting things that are said. For example, we're told that on the Lord's Day of the Lord, come together, break bread, and hold Eucharist, after confessing your transgressions, that your offering may be pure. But let none who has a quarrel with his fellow join in your meeting until they be reconciled, that your sacrifice be not defiled. It's not a bad rule. That would be a good thing sometimes. And so there are particular rules about how people are expected to behave, about how they're expected to get along with each other. You have rules about who can take the Eucharist. You have rules about who can be present for all of these things. There are rules about the appointment of bishops and deacons, no priest, because they weren't any priest. And so there are rules about who can be a bishop, who can be a deacon. And then there's also room for prophets and teachers. These people will teach, they'll do all of these things for the people that we would normally think of as far as that goes. And then later on in all of this, there is this notion about kind of the last section has to do with what really strikes me as being basic rules of life. That this is how, on a day-to-day basis, that this is the way in which we live with other people and each other. And so it becomes this. And then it ends with this section about who there will be a fiery trial, that many shall be offended and be lost. In other words, it talks about the end of the world at that particular point in time. So this is a very interesting book. It's a very interesting little document. And this is one of the first ones that we know of. It's kind of funny. The Didache, there's some confusion about this. There's some belief that there was a purely Jewish version of the Didache that was written before the birth of Christ. But there's some controversy about that. Not everybody believes that was true. This Didache that we found right here, or that we're looking at, was found in the 19th century by the Archbishop of Jerusalem, who was a Greek archbishop. And the Didache that he found actually was written in Greek, but they dated it back to that first century. And so, and it's I don't know of anybody that really denies its authenticity. It really has that. Later on, you still see other versions of it coming out, some of it being entirely Jewish in nature, some of it being otherwise. But this, over time, has really become kind of the gold standard of Didaches. It was, it's a truly inspirational and a truly authoritative document that we have. And so this was really, at a time when letters were being written and sent off to Corinth and wherever, at a time when gospels are being composed, almost nobody had seen those things. And so for most people at that time, this is how they learned their Christianity. This is how they learned what the faith was and how they lived the faith. And so it's extremely important as far as that goes. It's perhaps one of the most influential things that we can possibly think of from the point of view of early Christianity. That's, we're close to the end. Does anybody have any thoughts or any questions about any of this? Yeah.
Speaking of the earlier part of your talk, with the growth of false religions, almost Gnostic-like,
yeah.
were these, do you think, attempts to imitate Christianity in some way?
They were. I think they were expressly that people, and see, there's this extra bit that Gnostic writings had that kind of gave them some appeal, and that was, this was secret knowledge. That the knowledge that they put into the Gnostic writing was secret. It was only for people that were supposed to hear it. And so it really became, it did. And that was kind of the appeal to it, I think. Oftentimes there'd be particular ranks of angels in different places and different things. It would sometimes, of course, sometimes it would, or oftentimes it would have Christ, but it would not be truly recognizable. The hero might be Mary Magdalene, it might be Thomas, it might be whatever, who honestly had nothing to do with whatever their name was on. People would say, Thomas, he never wrote anything, but I've got knowledge about Thomas, so we're going to write this thing, and off it goes. In a lot of ways, it was real bugaboo for the early church. And it became a part of it as a result of the Gnostic writings. Sometimes there would be really slander against the church. In Alexandria, the church felt obliged to, they would close the door, right, when it came to communion. everybody that was not a member of the church or baptized would be asked to leave. And so the rumor got around that they were killing babies, and they were eating the baby. And so it was so bad, he had to actually, write something and say, we're not eating babies, we're not doing that. But people always like, people always like extreme foolishness, and that was Gnosticism. Anything else?
Do you know what the word dedicate means?
I'll be honest, I don't. I think it's Syrian to start with, but I do not know the actual meaning.
Well, I mean, the titles, I think it means the teaching, the dedicate or teaching is what awesome.
Yeah.
Dedicate.
I heard it was the way to live.
The way what?
The way to live.
Well, from a strictly Christian point of view, yeah. I mean, and you're right to the extent that there was a lot of writings going around, and they all intended to tell you how to live. Some of them were strictly Jewish, some of them otherwise.
I mean, is the subtitle here, is that actually part of the text, or is that part, the publisher or the writer? The Lord's teaching to the heathen by the 12 apostles, because the whole thing where the earliest years of the church were pretty much Jewish.
Yeah.
And so they had this whole foundation of a moral framing
Yeah.
in the law, and culturally it was long established. The tradition, for better or for worse, but the tradition.
Yeah.
As you go into the heathen world, the Gentile world, you read the beginning of Romans, and you just see this moral and spiritual chaos.
Yeah.
That was, and so bringing this moral instruction, kind of to people that have grown up in cultures that had no speed bumps, no guardrails, there certainly were, the Stoics, and there were moral people among the Gentiles, but a lot of these, and the church spread among the lower classes, generally, it's the sense you get from the Corinthian letter that, not many rich, not many wise, not many, God has chosen the least to put to shame the great. This beginning with basically the Sermon on the Mount, as these echoes in the Sermon on the Mount would be consistent with the Lord's Great Commission, where He commanded, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, and teaching them all things whatsoever I've commanded you. And so, you find that right here. It's like they lead off. The Ten Commandments come second.
Yeah.
It's because it is the Ten Commandments, the teachings. You have heard that it was said, the ancients were told, but I say to you. And so, both the Ten Commandments are deepened, but they're also, just having finished with Father Deacon Maximus, his life of David.
Mm-hmm.
The Sermon on the Mount doesn't map very good with David's. the way that life was lived,
And when you think about the Sermon on the Mount, you think about much that's in the Gospels. It seems to be kind of a deliberate thing to not just make rules, but to describe a manner of living.
It's a rule of the heart.
Yeah, I think that's true.
That's a good way of putting it.
And it is also, you see this all through the New Testament, but there are two ways, and it's like if you're not on, because you could easily read it because it presents say the Sermon on the Mount, we say that, and then all of these really wicked, evil things
Yeah.
You know, don't do those.
Yeah, yeah,
And, you know, the idea that people would say, okay, well, I don't do any of that.
yeah,
And so, and they can kind of make a third way,
yeah.
where it's like, I'm not doing those, but love my enemy? I don't think so.
People, there's still a third way. People
Yeah.
follow that.
Well, no, I know,
Yeah.
but the point is, there's not.
Yeah, there's
I
not
mean,
really.
There's not.
Yeah,
Either
yeah.
you're on the way of life or you're on the way of death.
That's right.
You know, and so there is no third way.
Yeah,
And that's the sobering thing about
Yeah.
when Christ says, follow me.
Yeah.
Take up your cross and follow me. He's only going in one direction. And
Yeah.
It's like every other degree on the compass is not following.
and you know, and that's the beauty of the Didache. I mean, it sets it out just like that.
Yeah.
Here's what you can do. This is how you have to live. Period. You know, there's no getting around it. If there are a lot of books that are interesting. If you wanted to pick up some of those or think about it, I had a hard time finding this when I was in seminary, and I finally did. It's called Daily Prayer in the Early Church. It's by a guy at Oxford called Paul Bradshaw. It's a really good book. And then there are 2 volumes of documents, the faith of the early fathers, 1 and 2, and then there's also one having to do with the development of the liturgy. And so there's a lot of work being done in this area, but I think there's a lot more that probably will show up as archaeology and whatnot goes on. Okay, all right, then we will do it again next week, and that'll be that. We're supposed to wave at George or not, but
George, when they kind